Steam rose in ghostly spirals from the surface of the glowing metal, creating a thick mist that partially obscured the contorted figure of the man suspended above the cauldron. His screams were no longer mere screams. They were primal lamentations, sounds that seemed to spring from the depths of the human soul, echoing through the Place de Grève like an infernal symphony that made even the most seasoned executioners avert their gaze. It was March 1757, and Robert-François Damiens, the man who had dared to raise a blade against the sacred body of King Louis XV, was paying the cruelest price French justice had ever conceived. In the gilded salons of Versailles, barely 4 months earlier, Damiens had paced the corridors like a spectre among the nobles. A valet of humble origins, born in Arras to a peasant family whose daily companion was hunger, he had obtained a minor position at court through obscure connections and whispered favors. His small, piercing eyes observed everything: the crystalline laughter of the ladies in their silk gowns, the conspiratorial whispers of the courtiers, the hypnotic glare of the crystal chandeliers reflecting a world of opulence unimaginable. To someone like him, Damiens was not just a servant. He was an invisible man in a universe where only the visible mattered, where his existence was tolerated as long as he remained silent and carried out his tasks with the discretion of a shadow. But within his narrow chest fermented something dark and uncontrollable. The nights at Versailles were long for those who served, and Damiens spent hours wandering the dimly lit corridors, listening to fragments of conversations filtering through the half-open doors of the royal apartments. There was talk of taxes that crushed the people like a relentless press, of distant wars that consumed the sons of the poor like wood in an insatiable fire, of decisions affecting millions of lives, made with the same carelessness with which one chooses wine for dinner. Anger grew within Damiens like a malignant tumor, fed by every indifferent laugh, every arrogant command, every moment his humanity was denied or ignored. The court of Louis XV was a magnificent theater where decadence wore masks of gold and diamonds. The king, at 47, had lost much of the vigor and authority that had marked his early years of reign. His face, once considered handsome by the standards of the time, now showed the unmistakable signs of a life devoted to excess. His cheeks, slightly swollen from constant wine drinking, his eyes having lost the sparkle of youth and acquired the opacity of one who has seen too much and felt too little. His hands, once steady when he held the scepter, trembled almost imperceptibly when he believed he was unobserved, betraying a vulnerability that royal etiquette forbade. Madame de Pompadour, his official mistress, perceived these changes with the perspicacity of one who had dedicated her life to reading the nuances of power. In her private letters to the Duchesse de Luynes, she described with growing concern how the king seemed to be sinking into a melancholy that neither carnal pleasures nor card games can dispel. Louis XV was becoming a man haunted by forebodings, tormented by dreams in which he saw furious mobs invade Versailles, or heard cries of "death to the tyrant," echoing through the perfectly manicured gardens that were both his pride and his prison. It was in this environment of disguised decadence and mounting tension that Damiens spent his last months as a free man. He observed everything with the morbid acuity of one who feels excluded from the feast of life, mentally memorizing every detail of royal hypocrisy. He saw the king feigning interest in his subjects during public audiences, while his eyes wandered impatiently to the windows, longing for the private pleasures that awaited him there. He heard whispers of revolts breaking out in the provinces, of peasants starving, while Versailles swallowed fortunes in a single celebration, of the growing anxiety fermenting in the streets of Paris like sour wine in a forgotten vat. Damiens's transformation from silent servant to lone conspirator didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual and heartbreaking process, like a wound slowly rotting beneath a clean bandage. He began frequenting the squalid taverns of Paris during his leaves, places where desperate men gathered to drink cheap wine and distill their venom against the monarchy. He heard horrific tales of executions, on summary accounts of peasants who refused to pay impossible taxes, on entire families expelled from their lands to satisfy the whims of an indebted nobleman, on children starving while the royal hunting dogs were fed fresh meat every day. In January 1757, something changed permanently in Damiens. Later witnesses described his eyes as those of a man possessed, shining with a feverish intensity that instinctively made people recoil. He stopped eating regularly, and his body, always thin, became almost skeletal. His hands trembled constantly, not from fear but from a pent-up energy that seemed ready to explode. He began muttering to himself as he worked, rambling words about justice and revenge that made the other servants exchange worried glances behind his back. January 5th, 1757, dawned with a biting cold that pierced the bone. The Parisian winter had always been cruel, but this year seemed particularly merciless, as if nature itself were conspiring to increase the general suffering. Damiens awoke before dawn, as he had every day for months, but this time there was an icy determination in his movements. He put on his simplest clothes, not the colorful garb that identified him as a royal valet, but the gray, anonymous clothes of an ordinary man. In his pockets, he concealed a narrow-bladed knife, no larger than a small table dagger, but as sharp as death itself. All morning, Damiens wandered the streets of Versailles like a ghost. He knew every corridor, every door, every staircase in the palace, and knew exactly when and where the king would make his daily public outing. Louis XV followed an almost religious routine of audiences and appointments, a schedule scrupulously adhered to like a Swiss watch, and Damiens had spent months studying every detail of this routine with the obsession of a military strategist. At 6 o'clock in the afternoon, when the winter sun was already hiding behind the bare trees of the royal gardens, Louis XV left his private apartments for the Trianon, where he was having lunch with a small group. He walked slowly, unhurriedly, protected only by 2 guards who kept a respectful distance. The king wore a dark blue velvet coat embroidered with gold thread, and his leather boots echoed on the polished marble corridors. There was something almost melancholic about his posture, his shoulders slightly slumped, his gaze lost, as if he were carrying an invisible weight that grew heavier every day. Damiens emerged from the shadows with the speed of a striking snake. He didn't scream, didn't utter any of the grandiloquent phrases he had mentally rehearsed for months. He simply stepped forward in deathly silence and plunged the blade between the king's ribs in a single precise movement that seemed rehearsed 1,000 times. The metal cut through velvet and flesh with a wet, sibilant sound, like fabric being torn, and for a moment that seemed eternal. The king and the assassin were united by that grotesque, definitive blade. Louis XV's scream echoed through the halls of Versailles like the wail of a soul torn from its body. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a primal howl of shock and terror, the sound a man utters when he suddenly understands that his mortality is not an abstract theory, but a tangible reality that has just penetrated his flesh. His eyes widened in utter disbelief, as if it were impossible for anyone to have dared to touch the sacred body of the King of France. Blood began to pool between his fingers as he pressed his hand against the wound, staining the blue velvet almost black in the dim light of the corridor. The royal guards reacted with the brutal speed of men trained to kill. Damiens made no attempt to flee. He remained motionless as a statue, observing the result of his deed with an expression that mixed satisfaction with horror. When the guard's hands grabbed his arms, he didn't resist. There was a strange serenity on his face, as if he had finally found a purpose that justified his entire miserable existence. His breathing was uneven, almost panting, but his eyes shone with a light that hadn't been there for years. The news of the attack spread through Versailles like a fire through a dry plantation. Within minutes, the entire palace was in turmoil. Nobles were running through the corridors in panic, ladies were fainting in the arms of their escorts, and an atmosphere of absolute terror hung over every room, every staircase, every corner where the golden routine of the courtyard. The air itself seemed to have changed, thicker, more oppressive, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand on end. Louis XV was immediately transported to his private apartments, where a team of royal physicians swarmed over his body like vultures over a carcass. The wound, fortunately for the king and unfortunately for Damiens, was not fatal. The blade had penetrated between the ribs but had deflected vital organs, causing exquisite pain and significant blood loss, but nothing directly life-threatening. However, the psychological shock was devastating. The king, who had believed himself untouchable, protected by the very divinity of his office, discovered in a brutal way that he was nothing but flesh and blood like any other man. In the hours following the attack, a collective paranoia gripped Versailles. Every servant was watched with suspicion, every movement analyzed, every face scrutinized for signs of conspiracy. The court, which had always lived in a bubble of artificial security, suddenly discovered that the outside world had found a way to penetrate its defenses. Nobles whispered about peasant revolts, Jesuit conspiracies, occult forces working to destroy the French monarchy. Fear had become a physical presence, palpable like damp in an abandoned cellar. Damiens, meanwhile, was led to the deepest dungeons of the Châtelet, the royal prison where crimes against the crown were interrogated with methods that made the torturers of the Inquisition look amateurish. He was chained in a windowless cell, where the only light came from torches crackling on the damp stone walls, creating dancing shadows resembling demons celebrating his capture. The smell was unbearable. A mixture of mold, human excrement, dried, blood, and something indefinable that could be despair crystallized into perfume. The interrogations began immediately. Jacques-Guillaume Turgot, the royal prosecutor with a narrow face and eyes as cold as stones at the bottom of a well, personally conducted the questioning. He was convinced that Damiens could not have acted alone, that behind this insignificant servant lurked a vast conspiracy threatening the very edifice of the French monarchy. For days, Damiens was subjected to torture sessions, beginning at dawn and ending only when he lost consciousness. These sessions were conducted with the scientific precision of a medical experiment. First came the questions, formulated in a calm, almost paternal voice by Turgot, while the torturers prepared their instruments with the meticulousness of surgeons preparing for a delicate operation. When Damiens insisted he had acted alone, driven solely by his own anger and despair, the torturers sprang into action. They began with relatively gentle methods, twisting his fingers, gradually applying pressure to his wrists, and small, superficial cuts that bled just enough to cause pain without threatening his life. Gradually, as Damiens maintained his version of events, the methods became more savage. His fingernails were torn off one by one with fire-heated pliers, each tear accompanied by a scream that echoed through the dungeons like the wail of lost souls. His feet were slowly crushed in an iron press until the bones turned to bloody pulp, barely able to support his weight. Heated needles were inserted beneath his skin at points specifically chosen to maximize pain without causing permanent damage to vital organs. Throughout this process, Damiens held firm, maintaining his story with a tenacity that impressed even his torturers. There were no conspirators, no hidden masterminds, no elaborate plan. There was just an ordinary man who had reached the limit of his capacity to bear injustice and decided to act in the only way his tortured mind could conceive. His cries of pain were interspersed with fragmented statements about the misery of the people, the royal indifference, and the need for someone to pay for the suffering of the innocent. After 2 weeks of fruitless interrogation, it became clear to the authorities that Damiens had truly acted alone. Paradoxically, this made his crime even more terrifying. If there had been a conspiracy, it could have been dismantled, its members imprisoned, and the threat neutralized. But an ordinary man deciding on his own to attack the sacred body of the king represented something far more frightening. The possibility that a subject at any moment could be seized by that same homicidal madness. It was like discovering that the very air they breathed could suddenly become poisonous. The decision on Damiens' fate was made during a secret meeting between Louis XV, still recovering from his physical and psychological injuries, and his closest advisors. The king, always known for his relative clemency, now displayed a thirst for revenge that shocked even the most hardened courtiers. His eyes, once melancholy, shone with a mineral hardness when he spoke of the punishment to be inflicted on the man who had dared to touch him. He intended Damiens' execution to become such a horrifying spectacle that no Frenchman would ever forget the price paid for daring to take the king's life. The sentence passed on Robert François Damiens was a masterpiece of legal sadism. He was to be taken to the Place de Grève on a cart, naked from the waist down, where he would undergo the most cruel torture imaginable. First, his right hand, the one that had wielded the weapon against the king, would be burned with molten sulfur. Then, his flesh would be lacerated with red-hot pincers in specific areas of his body, and a mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, burning pitch, wax, and sulfur would be poured into the open wounds. Finally, he would be tied to 4 horses pulling in 4 opposite directions until his body was literally quartered. The news of this execution spread through Paris like a plague. For weeks, it was the only topic of conversation in taverns, markets, churches, the homes of the nobles, and the hovels of the poor. Some expressed horror at the brutality of the sentence. Others considered it just for such a heinous crime. But everyone, absolutely everyone, knew they would be present. At the Place de Grève, on the day set for the execution, it was as if the entire Parisian population had been hypnotized by a morbid curiosity surpassing all moral or human considerations. In the days leading up to the execution, Damiens was kept in a special cell, fed just enough to stay alive and conscious, but not enough to give him the strength to resist what was about to happen to him. He had changed physically dramatically during those months of detention. His body, always thin, was now nothing but skin and bones, his ribs visible through the pale, translucent skin. His hair, previously brown, had turned completely white, and his beard had grown unevenly, giving him the appearance of a mad prophet emerging from the desert. But what was most striking were his eyes. They were no longer the angry, blazing eyes that had characterized his final months at Versailles. There was something almost supernatural in their gaze, a depth that seemed to see through people, through walls, through reality itself. Some guards swore they had heard him speaking with invisible entities, gesturing toward empty corners of the cell and answering questions no one had asked. Others claimed to have heard laughter escaping from his cell in the early hours of the morning, laughter devoid of any humanity, chilling the blood. The priest charged with administering Damiens' last rites later described the encounter as one of the most disturbing experiences of his entire clerical career. Damiens listened to prayers with almost supernatural attention, but his answers to questions about repentance and salvation were enigmatic and philosophical in a way that seemed impossible for a man of such limited education. He spoke of cycles of violence, the corrupt nature of power, and the inevitability of revolution with an eloquence that left the priest perplexed and vaguely terrified. The morning of March 28, 1757, dawned under a menacing grey sky, as if the clouds themselves refused to let the sun illuminate the spectacle that was about to unfold. A cold wind blew through the streets of Paris, carrying the smell of the pyres already lit on the Place de Grève, mingled with the sweat and impatience of the crowd gathered before dawn. There were thousands of them, nobles in their elaborate robes occupying the windows of the buildings surrounding the square, bourgeois who had paid considerable sums for privileged seats, and a compact mass of plebeians crammed together in a human density that made breathing difficult. The cart carrying Damiens emerged from the narrow streets like an apparition straight from hell. He was naked from the waist down, as required by the sentence, and his pale skin contrasted cruelly with the still fresh wounds from the interrogations. His hands were chained behind his back, forcing him. He remained upright, giving the impression of dignity, even in the face of utter degradation. His eyes roamed the crowd without any apparent fear, as if assessing every face, memorizing every expression of hatred, curiosity, or horror he encountered. The chief executioner, Henri Sanson, was an enormous man with hands the size of shovels and an expression of professional indifference acquired after decades of cruel executions. He had carried out hundreds of executions, from simple beheadings to elaborate tortures, but even he seemed slightly unnerved by the extent of the punishment he was about to inflict. His assistants, men hardened by practice, moved with grim efficiency, preparing the instruments of torture with the meticulousness of a watchmaker adjusting a delicate mechanism. The first torture was the burning of the right hand with molten sulfur. Damiens was tied to a vertical post, his right arm extended on a wooden platform. The sulfur, heated in an iron pan to a liquid consistency, shone like molten gold in the diffused morning light. When the red-hot metal touched his skin, the sound was both a hiss and a crackle, like bacon in a pan heated to the highest point. The flesh literally bubbled, releasing steam and a pungent odor that made hundreds of spectators wrinkle their noses, forcing them to cover their nostrils with scented handkerchiefs. Damien's scream as the sulfur touched his hand was a sound many of those present carried to their graves. It was no ordinary human scream. It was something primal and animal, a sound that seemed to spring from the depths of pain so intense that it surpassed the limits of normal human experience. His head snapped back with such force that it hit the wooden post, and blood began to flow from the back of his skull, mixing with the sweat that beaded every pore of his body. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the scream. It was what came next. When the initial pain gave way to a constant throbbing torture, Damiens began to laugh. It wasn't hysterical or demented laughter, but something low and guttural, coming from a place much deeper than his throat. His eyes focused on the crowd, scanning faces as if he were memorizing them, and his laughter grew louder, clearer, more terribly human. Several people in the audience instinctively began to recoil, as if something in that laughter awakened a primal fear nestled deep within their minds. The second torture involved using red-hot pliers to lacerate his flesh at specific points on his body. The executioners had chosen areas where the pain would be greatest: the armpits, the inner thighs, the chest, just above the heart, the sides of the neck where the nerves were most exposed. Each application of the pliers tore off a piece of flesh the size of a coin, leaving gaping, bloody wounds, exposing muscle, and in some cases, bone. During this process, which lasted over an hour, Damiens developed a strange technique for managing the pain. He closed his eyes and moved his lips silently, as if reciting a mantra or a prayer. From time to time, he would open his eyes and stare intently at a particular face in the crowd, as if making a choice, marking that person in some mysterious way. Later witnesses described the sensation of being watched by something not entirely human, something that had transcended the normal bounds of mortal experience through extreme suffering. It was as the mixture of molten lead, boiling oil, burning pitch, wax and sulfur was being applied to the open wounds that something extraordinary happened. The mixture, heated to such a temperature that the air trembled around it like an illusion in the desert, was poured into Damien's wounds. His reaction was completely unexpected. Instead of screaming or begging for mercy, he began to speak. These words were not the incoherence of a man driven mad by pain. They were clear, articulate speech, delivered in a voice that carried farther than his sore throat should have allowed. He spoke of the sins of the monarchy, the misery of the French people, and the inevitability of divine justice, which would one day claim every nobleman, every prelate, every person who had remained silent in the face of oppression. His words were prophetic in a way that made many of those present squirm with discomfort, as if hearing truths they would rather ignore. "You who have come here to see a man die," his voice echoed through the square with a clear supernatural power, "remember that every drop of my blood is a seed planted in French soil. You think you are killing a rebellion, but you are only fueling it. My children, my unborn children, you will grow up in a world where kings bleed like ordinary men, where palaces burn like peasant cottages." The crowd reacted to these words with a mixture of fascination and terror. Some shouted for him to be silent, others made the sign of the cross incessantly, and a few remained paralyzed by the prophetic force of his words. The executioners, uncomfortable with the turn the execution was taking, hastened the process, pouring the remaining incandescent mixture into his wounds in an attempt to make him lose consciousness quickly. But Damien's did not lose consciousness. His wounds were literally smoking, giving off steam as if his body were a living forge, and the smell of burning flesh spread across the square in a thick, nauseating cloud. Through a pain said to have destroyed all human spirit, he continued to speak, his words becoming more urgent, more visionary, as if he knew his time was ending and he must impart these truths before he died. The final phase of the execution was quartering by horses, a torture so brutal that it was reserved for the most atrocious crimes against the crown. 4 horses were brought into the square, magnificent animals chosen for their strength and endurance. Damien's was untied from his stake and laid on the ground, where thick ropes were tied to his wrists and ankles. Each rope was then connected to one of the horses, so that when the animals were whipped in opposite directions, Damien's body would literally be torn apart by the force. It was at this moment that the execution took an unexpected turn that would become a legend on the streets of Paris for decades to come. The horses were whipped simultaneously, and all pulled with all their might, but Damien's body did not dislocate. The ligaments and muscles, perhaps hardened by extreme suffering or by some inexplicable physiological phenomenon, resisted the force that should have torn him apart in seconds. The horses pulled for 10 minutes, then 15, then half an hour, while Damien's remained consciously alive and intact, stretched like a puppet in a torture that should have lasted barely a moment. The crowd then murmured about divine intervention, supernatural signs, the possibility that Damien's was protected by forces beyond human comprehension. Some cried that it was a miracle and that he should be spared. Others claimed it was the work of the devil and that the torture should be intensified. Even Henry Sanson, an experienced executioner, seemed visibly troubled by the inexplicable resistance of Damien's body. The decision was then made to use knives to cut into Damien's joints, weakening the connection points to facilitate dismemberment. Even at this stage, as his limbs were methodically severed while he remained conscious and the horses continued to pull, Damien's retained a preternatural lucidity. He observed the entire process with an almost scientific curiosity, as if studying his own physical destruction with academic interest. When the incisions were made and the horses finally succeeded in separating his limbs, the sound was something none of the thousands present would ever forget. It wasn't just the crunch of breaking bones or the viscous sound of tearing flesh. It was something deeper and more disturbing, as if the very fabric of reality was being ripped apart along with Damien's body. His arms detached from his torso, with a noise that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal human perception, and spurts of blood painted the stone floor of the square, a color that seemed darker than natural red. The most extraordinary thing was that, even after his limbs were dismembered, Damien's remained conscious. His mutilated torso still moved, his eyes continued to scan the faces in the crowd, and his mouth moved as if to form words. Witnesses swore. They heard whispers escape his lips, words that seemed like prophecies or curses, depending on the listener's perspective. Blood spurted from his wounds at a speed meant to cause instant death, but his heart continued to beat with a persistence that defied medical logic. For another 20 minutes, Damien's torso remained alive, his eyes methodically scanning the crowd, as if memorizing each face for a future destiny. Ribble. His pupils dilated and contracted in a rhythm disconnected from the ambient light, and a few closer observers swore they saw reflections of impossible images on the surface of his eyes, visions of burning cities, furious crowds, palaces crumbling in apocalyptic destruction. When he finally expired, it was neither with a sigh nor a groan, but with something akin to a low, satisfied laugh, as if he had seen, at the moment of death, something confirming all his darkest expectations. His eyes remained open, staring at a precise point in the crowd where a group of nobles watched from the window of a small mansion. Even in death, his gaze retained an intensity that made these nobles instinctively recoil from their windows, as if a dead man's curse could cross distance and physically touch them. The crowd, who had come to witness a spectacle of royal justice, left the Place de Grève in an almost funereal silence. There were no shouts of approval or celebrations, usually accompanying a public execution. Instead, there was an atmosphere of profound unease, as if everyone had witnessed something beyond the bounds of ordinary punishment and entering the realm of the supernatural. Many people reported having nightmares in the following weeks, dreaming of seeing Damien's reappear whole, laughing and pointing at them with silent accusations that pierced the very marrow of their conscience. In the days following the execution, strange phenomena began to be reported throughout Paris. People swore they had seen Damien's figure wandering the streets in the early hours of the morning, always near symbols of royal authority, near statues of kings, outside government buildings, in the gardens of noble residences. These apparitions were not threatening in the traditional sense, but they emanated a presence that made animals nervous and children cry for no apparent reason. Even more disturbing were the accounts of people claiming to have heard Damien's voice whispering through the walls of their homes, always during the darkest hours of the night. The words he allegedly uttered were always the same, prophecies of the fall of the monarchy, of royal blood flowing in the streets of Paris, of a time when the poor would rise up and the rich would taste fear. At first, these stories were dismissed as the superstition of simple folk, but when they began to spread in the most cultured circles of Parisian society, a genuine concern gripped the city. Louis XV himself, still recovering physically and psychologically from the assassination attempt, began to exhibit a paranoia that far exceeded legitimate concern for his safety. His servants reported that he would wake up shouting Damien's name, and that he would spend hours peering out the window at night, as if expecting to see a sinister figure emerge from the shadows of the Versailles gardens. His doctors prescribed increasingly powerful tonics to help him sleep, But even under the influence of the strongest remedies, he suffered nightmares in which Damiens appeared not as an ordinary man, but as a force of nature, a human storm heralding cataclysmic changes. Madame de Pompadour, always attentive to the king's moods and nuances, recorded in her private memoirs the dramatic transformation she observed in Louis XV after Damiens' execution. "He is no longer the same man," she noted in increasingly shaky handwriting. "There is something in his eyes that wasn't there before, a shadow that grows every day, as if he had seen that terrible day and it had changed his fundamental understanding of the nature of royal power. He speaks less and less, laughs even less, and when he thinks no one is watching, his hands tremble like leaves in the wind." Damiens' execution had repercussions extending far beyond the immediate shock of its brutality. Paradoxically, instead of deterring other potential regicides, it seemed to have planted a slowly germinating seed of disquiet in the French collective consciousness. In taverns, in marketplaces, in the spontaneous conversational circles that formed on the streets of Paris, people discussed not so much the justice of the punishment as the supernatural resilience Damiens had displayed. How could an ordinary man have endured such suffering and still remained lucid until the end? How had he managed to transform his own destruction into an act of defiance that resonated beyond death? These questions particularly alarmed the French intellectual class, which was beginning to question not only the legitimacy of the monarchy, but the very nature of political power. Voltaire, cautious in his direct criticism of the regime, wrote in private letters about Damiens' terrible eloquence of suffering, suggesting that there was something profoundly wrong with a system that required such barbarism to maintain itself. Diderot, more daring in his thinking, began to develop theories of human resistance that would greatly influence the Enlightenment. But it was among the most disadvantaged classes that Damiens' example had the most profound and lasting impact. Peasants living in abject poverty whispered stories of a man who had touched the king's body and died laughing. A man who had transformed his own execution into a prophecy of revenge. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, growing more complex and mythical, until Damiens became less a historical figure than an urban legend. The man who had demonstrated that kings also bleed, that palaces could be stormed, that the apparent invincibility of the monarchy was merely an illusion, maintained by force and fear. In the following years, France continued its inexorable decline toward the crisis that culminated in the Revolution of 1789. Every new tax, every new manifestation of royal indifference to popular suffering, every new demonstration of the decadence of the court was interpreted through the prism of Damiens' prophetic words during his execution. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, he inherited not only a financially ruined kingdom, but also a people who had learned, thanks to the example of an insignificant servant, that royal authority was neither divine nor inviolable. The ultimate irony of Damiens' execution was that, in seeking to turn it into a spectacle of terror to deter rebellion, the French monarchy unwittingly created a symbol of resistance infinitely more dangerous than the living man. Every detail of the torture, every moment of his supernatural resilience, every word of his prophecies was preserved in the French collective memory as proof that it was possible to defy absolute power and die with dignity. When the revolution finally broke out in 1789, many of the revolutionaries who invaded the Bastille and stormed Versailles were, consciously or not, following the example of Robert François Damiens. They had learned that kings were mortal, that palaces could be stormed, that the apparent invincibility of the aristocracy was merely a facade maintained by fear and tradition. The man drawn and quartered in the Place de Grève 32 years, earlier had sown a seed that grew into a tree, whose fruits were the guillotine and the revolutionary terror. When Louis XVI laid his head on the block of the guillotine on January 21st, 1793, echoes of Damien's cry could be heard in the roar of the crowd demanding his death. When Marie Antoinette followed the same path a few months later, the prophetic words about royal blood flowing in the streets of Paris literally came true. The revolution Damiens had foretold in his final agony had finally arrived, bringing a violence that would make his own execution seem almost merciful by comparison. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Damiens' legacy was not his influence on subsequent political events, but his demonstration that human resilience could transcend the apparent limits of biology and psychology. His ability to maintain lucidity and articulate speech during torture that was supposed to destroy any normal human mind suggested terrifying possibilities about the latent potential of human consciousness in the face of extreme situations. Physicians and philosophers of the time were forced to rethink their theories about the relationship between physical pain and mental awareness. If an ordinary man could endure such suffering while retaining not only his sanity, but also his capacity for deep thought and articulate expression, what other seemingly absolute limits could be mere illusions? Damiens' execution not only called into question the political authority of the French monarchy, but also fundamental premises about the nature of human experience. The Place de Grève, where the execution took place, became an unofficial pilgrimage, site for those seeking to understand or channel what Damiens had drawn from his final moments. Visitors experienced strange sensations, a sense of density in the air, vivid daydreams in the nights following the visit, and a heightened sensitivity to social injustices that lasted for several weeks. The stone floor, permanently stained with Damiens' blood, was sometimes scraped by people believing the fragments possessed almost magical properties. These beliefs were not entirely irrational in the context of the time. Damiens' execution had demonstrated that reality could be far stranger and more malleable than commonly assumed. If an ordinary man could transcend the apparent limits of human endurance through the strength of his conviction, what other impossibilities could be overcome with the right will and determination? This question haunted the collective French imagination for decades, contributing to an atmosphere of revolutionary possibilities that ultimately materialized in the form of radical political and social change. Looking back, that cold March morning in 1757 impresses with the magnitude of the consequences stemming from a single act of desperate violence. Robert-François Damiens, a man who likely died without fully understanding the meaning of his own prophetic words, had sown a seed that would grow to consume the entire political and social structure of Ancien Régime France. His execution revealed not only the brutality of the system it sought to defend, but also its fundamental fragility. Using such a spectacle of terror to punish a single man paradoxically demonstrated the monarchy's fear of its own vulnerabilities. In attempting to make Damiens a deterrent, they had unwittingly created a martyr whose example would inspire generations of revolutionaries. Even more profoundly, Damiens' supernatural resistance to extreme torture suggested the existence of untapped reserves of human strength in ordinary circumstances. His ability to transform his own suffering into a form of political resistance showed that, even in the most desperate situations, human consciousness could find ways to transcend its apparent limitations and touch something closer to the absolute.